We want to bring on journalist and host of the Empire Files, Abby Martin, to the show here next. Abby, thank you so much for joining us on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me, Eugene, and props to the whole team. Love the show.
Well, I'll tell you, the pleasure is all ours. We're all big fans of the Empire Files here as well, empirefiles.tv for those of you in listener land. I want to start here, Abby, sort of unexpectedly in this afternoon. The Biden administration, I don't know what they announced, but they allegedly announced that they were going to leave the war in Yemen and sometime in the future. Should we be excited about this? Is this portending anything good? Is it window dressing? How are you viewing this?
I think it's a great start. This is something that Biden was promising during his campaign. This is one of the few changes that we were expecting to happen under his tenure, and he immediately fulfilled at least temporarily those weapon shipments to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which I think is a huge move. And, you know, everyone gave Trump credit for supposedly being anti-war when we can't forget that he vetoed that bill that tried to end those U.S. weapon shipments. So this is really just aiding and abetting genocide. I mean, it's sad that it had to get to this point where tens of millions of people are starving to death in Yemen. There is a small caveat that I heard Blinken talking about potentially sanctioning the Houthi rebels on the ground. He claims that the Houthis control 80% of Yemeni territory. I don't know how true that is, but so there is something there to be said about what exactly will that mean moving forward with humanitarian assistance that they so desperately need. And also, of course, this doesn't deter the support, you know, the staunch support for Saudi Arabia in general. So this has already been reiterated by Anthony Blinken, saying, of course, we need Saudi Arabia to carry out counterterrorism measures in the region. So this is just an end to the offensive, logistical, tactical support, and of course the weapons, because it was much more than weapons that the U.S. was doing to help kill Yemenis. And also Blinken reiterated the fact that we are going to also help Riyadh with defense against Houthi attacks on the border.
Well, I think those are very important caveats, certainly ones that are good for the military contractors with that defense there. I mean, I wonder what you're making of Blinken so far. I mean, it almost feels, you know, I don't want to say too much editorializing, but it just seems that, I don't know, new neocon warmonger the same as the old one.
I mean, this is, like you said, window dressing. This is your classic neoliberal interventionist, right? So to mask all the language and humanitarianism, but really when you unmask who he is, he's just the same old, good old boy that essentially Mike Pompeo was, just with more gentle language and maybe not the religious zealotry, but who knows? So yeah, I mean, Blinken is so far a complete and total disaster. I mean, what I think people need to remember is that he was actually Biden's closest foreign policy advisor when Biden championed the invasion of Iraq. So this is something that is such a horrible legacy for anyone. They have to completely denounce their support for Iraq at this point. And the fact that he was in Biden's ear when Biden was leading the charge for the Democratic support, I think is something that really needs to be said about who Blinken is at his core, not to mention the hardline support for the war in Libya against Muammar Gaddafi. And also he says that the US didn't go far enough in Syria. He is an advocate of regime change there. So we could see some ugly maneuvering in Syria as well. And we also have to look at his shadowy past at West Exec Advisors. This is kind of a modeling off the Kissinger and Associates group that literally claimed to help defense corporations market their products to the Pentagon. So, I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to see a lot of unification with the most imperialist warmongers on the Republican side when it comes to Latin America, China, and the Middle East, unfortunately.
I think that's actually a crucially important point, because I think, you know, in the era of Trump, in many ways it was lost how much continuity there is in foreign policy on both sides. And I just wonder if this is maybe one of the dangers of the Democrats as the front man, if you will, is that since they bring a little more civility, a little more, just a less odious je ne sais quoi to it, that it can lull people to sleep a little bit about how bad it really is.
this is the big problem, right, with the Democratic Party is, well, there's a lot of problems with the Democratic Party, but in the most egregious cases, they cheered on Trump's atrocities and war crimes all across the world when Trump was president for 4 years. And this is the thing that really irks me, is that Trump exacerbated drone strikes 300%. Trump added hundreds of genocidal sanctions on countries all around the world, bringing people to the brink of starvation in many countries, just absolutely horrific, sadistic stuff there, Eugene. And what I find bizarre is that the Biden administration has not talked about any of these things. They've not talked about reining any of these policies back. And so what they're doing is re-inheriting, because we're talking about the Obama administration really overseeing that killer drone empire, Trump expanding it to record levels and making it way less accountable. And now you have Biden's team coming in, overseeing a less accountable, widely expansive drone empire. All of these sanctions, we already know when it comes to Iran, they're stripping the negotiations and saying, no, you need to capitulate to our demands and these benchmarks that we're not going to drop any of the sanctions. Trump put 800 plus sanctions on Iran. I mean, that is absolutely insane. So Blinken and all of Biden's foreign policy advisors are not talking about any of these things. And we even see Jen Psaki talking about how excited she is about overseeing the Space Force. I mean, this is not just a joke. I know it's like a show on TV and it's just like some big comical thing about Trump. But really, when you look at what Space Force is, not only is it a boon to the military industrial complex, but it also is violating several treaties and starting a new arms war.
I think that's an extraordinary point, because it is such a joke and a sideshow, and the flag looking like Star Trek. But I mean, it seems like one of many things: the Space Force, the new Cold War, the rehash of the. It just feels. I mean, I almost feel weird saying it, because people say, "Oh, well, that seems so crazy. Why would you say that?" But it feels like the danger of nuclear war is so deeply rooted in these institutions, but it can so easily be turned into a joke. But I mean, it seems like the consequences of this are potentially catastrophic as can be.
Absolutely, which is why it's also very problematic that Biden is having a more hostile front toward Russia. I mean, this is a nuclear armed country. They have the second largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. And instead of rehabilitating the relationship, because Trump certainly wasn't good on Russia, even though everyone painted him as a Putin puppet, Biden is taking this aggressive stance and Blinken is taking this aggressive stance. And it's just absolutely outrageous. We need to be talking to these leaders. We need to be talking about scaling down these absurd arsenals of nuclear weapons and essentially, at the end of the day, obliterating them all, because we're never going to really be safe with all of these nukes on the planet, Eugene. But one thing you mentioned earlier was the bipartisan kind of uniformity when it comes to the foreign policy establishment approach. And I can't think of a better example than Venezuela. It's absolutely disgusting and reprehensible what Biden is doing. Not only did he cater to like the right-wing, Venezuelans his entire campaign, but he immediately, as one of his first acts, recognized Juan Guaido. This guy isn't even a legislator in Venezuela anymore. Like, who is this person? And also Blinken signaling to Marco Rubio, the most abhorrent of all figures in Venezuela, who actually tweeted a open lynch threat against Maduro during the coup attempt, akin to the lynching of Muammar Gaddafi. And his account was actually fine, and it's still active on Twitter. But Blinken signaled to him and just said, I can't wait to work with you on Venezuela. So we're going to have to really build the pressure there to prevent another immediate coup attempt under Biden.
I mean, it really is through the looking glass. I saw a photo of Guaido. I think it was from this weekend of him he was talking about he was having a press conference, I guess, about the vaccines. And he's just like at a completely random table in the middle of the street with like 12 people. And he's like, I actually can't do anything about vaccines. And I just thought, what world are we living in that you could pretend that this guy is the president? I mean, it's the worst of imperial hubris, I feel like. And I think you made the point very well, the bipartisan nature, the Marco Rubios. It's this sense of, since I can do anything, I will do anything.
Absolutely. And you saw Blinken actually in an interview with Andrea Mitchell just recently, basically say just that. I mean, we are the arbiters of human rights and democracy, and Trump eroded that, and we need to re-implement that. And that's why he was most worried, it seemed, about the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, because it, made the image of America falter around the world, and he really wants to reassert that so they can get back to business.
I'm glad you brought up Iran, which raises another issue, which is Israel. Are you expecting any change on that front?
Well, Biden infamously said he didn't want to move the embassy back, so he is going to stay with that policy that was an absolutely disastrous policy that we saw prompt the entire Great March of Return. Of course, that was, facilitated our movie, Gaza Fights for Freedom. Tens of thousands of Palestinians were unarmed, marching to the partition fence that separates them from their ancestral lands, and they were mowed down by Israeli snipers. A lot of them were wounded, but a lot of them were also killed extrajudicially. This was something that was all sparked by the moving of the embassy. Now, of course, Biden is saying he doesn't want to recognize anything else. The only thing that I think we will see a difference on Palestine is potentially refunding the UNRWA aid that Trump ripped out under refugees. That was absolutely devastating to people who needed immediate access to medical care and other types of aid. And so hopefully Biden will reinstate that. That is very, very urgently needed for the millions of refugees in Gaza and elsewhere. But as far as anything else, no. I mean, Biden has bragged for years about being a staunch Zionist. He has a 100% rating from AIPAC. We're not going to see anything else change on that front.
Well, I'm certainly glad you mentioned the fantastic documentary, Gaza Fights for Freedom, and everything you guys do at Empire Files is fantastic. I hope people check it out. But it reminds me of something else, and something I appreciate about what you all do is that, obviously we're in a battle of a lot of different things, and we have to push and we have to make pressure, but it feels like a lot of what we're in right now is almost information warfare. Like, there's a lot of information out there, but figuring out how to bring it all together and what that coherent critique is so difficult that, I don't know, it seems to me maybe more now than even in the Trump era, critical media, especially on issues related to imperialism, is well, I don't know, I guess I already said it's crucial, but it's crucial.
This is why Breakthrough News is so crucial, and people really need to spread the word, because it's one of the best alternative media platforms out there. And in terms of how the media will shift their tone with Biden, I think we're going to see exactly what we saw during the lead up to the election, Eugene. I mean, during his entire primary campaign, they were totally uncritical. There was no coverage of him being a serial plagiarist or pathological liar or, rape allegations against him. It was, of course, all centered, the ire was all centered on Bernie Sanders, and we saw how that turned out. So we're going to see the same exact tone be taken during Biden's entire administration. I mean, let's face it. Trump tapped into this kind of growing distrust of the corporate media, calling everything that wasn't sycophantic coverage of him fake news. And I think that what that did ultimately was undermine and delegitimize the corporate media to the extent that they were just obsessed with him, because they consider themselves, of course, the end-all be-all, truth tellers, right? Like, and everything kind of goes back to these corporate media narratives, whether you're looking at, the algorithms changing or how Wikipedia is structured, all of these things. So they were absolutely insulted and devastated at that. But that wasn't the reason why they obsessively covered Trump. It was because he was a boon for their advertising structure and for their ratings. They saw ratings like none other when Trump was president. So, of course, they couldn't get out of their own way with constantly covering every single thing he did, even though we saw how that turned out. He was able to basically tap into their faults and spread so much right-wing propaganda that you have half of the country just not believing in COVID, protesting the vaccine. We just saw a huge protest in LA against the vaccination center. This is the effect of Trumpism, and also not just his right-wing media sphere, but the corporate media in general, covering him nonstop, these press conferences, the talking points, the tweets, and not having any sort of retrospective, like no accountability of how we got Trump, So now it's just this huge sigh of relief. Well, now it's back to sanity and civility, because the corporate media is an arm of the empire. They're an arm of the Pentagon. And all they want is to basically reassure people that everything's back to normal now. Trump is out. They're desperate for this return to normalcy, because Trump threw the emphasis array, and that's really what shook the establishment to its core the most. But Eugene, we saw the corporate media covered Trump when it came to his war crimes. They were near tears. Brian Williams, Fareed Zakaria saying this is when Trump became president. So we're going to go back to the same sort of imperialist warmongering, but again, through the lens of humanitarianism, just the way they like it.
Yes, the good old bait and switch. Look over here while we do this over there. I mean, it really can be just hard to even imbibe the scale of the lies that are being told. I think that makes it harder to grasp onto because it is so big. And I just wonder on that basis, mentioning algorithms too, if you're concerned about well, I'll put this another way. I saw Biden also announce this week a reality czar that's designed to combat disinformation, another air quotes there, online. But it seems to me that when you hear that, it's really like, well, you know, how do we undermine narratives on issues we don't like? I mean, it seems, you know, Twitter, Facebook, there's a lot of things they're doing, but that to me seems very dangerous, this push that like, well, there's all this disinformation, not that there isn't, but they're rarely talking about the real disinformation. They seem to be mainly talking about, you know, Russia, China, Iran, whatever.
Yeah, that's what we've seen. Ever since Trump won, they couldn't blame the system. They couldn't blame neoliberalism. They couldn't blame themselves. So they had to point to fake news, right? In general, the Pizzagate phenomenon, all of these things that erupted from the WikiLeaks files on Podesta. And that led to this kind of fallout from Russiagate in general that I was actually in part a victim of, where the DNI report came out, this joint report that basically blamed Russia Today and a bunch of other nonsense for giving us Trump and aiding and abetting, sowing radical discontent and discord among the American public. And it pointed from everything from Black Lives Matter activists to Occupy Wall Street people to like, it was so absurd. But what it resulted in, Eugene, was Google changing the algorithm and making websites like Counterpunch, like World Socialist website, all these websites that ran counter to the corporate media narrative about capitalism and empire were essentially backpaged into oblivion, where you can't even find these websites anymore unless you are looking specifically for them. If you're doing research on an issue, you get corporate media for the first like 5 pages. It is really, really sad because a lot of people don't even realize that this happened. And like you mentioned, social media giants have curated our reality for the last couple of years, and it's becoming more and more insulated, where now you have something like the Alliance for Securing Democracy, who actually Jake Sullivan, one of Biden's another foreign policy team, is actually on the think tank board of, along with other very sinister officials, that also has this black box algorithm that determines who is and who is not a Russian bot and essentially just scrapes their account. So while there is every news story about like purging right-wing accounts or QAnon or Trump himself, who has now become the martyr and somehow this breaking point of the slippery slope of the internet of tech censorship. This has been going on for years against leftists, against communists, against government officials in other countries, Chavistas, Iranian officials. I mean, this has been happening for so long that it's hard to find sympathy for Trump specifically when leftists have really been the ultimate targets for censorship. And unfortunately, it's not going to stop because we know that is ultimately the target and the goal of these tech giants working in concert with the government.
You know, I remember that DNI report. They isolated, among other things, the third-party debate that you hosted that I was honored to be a part of. And it's just so funny that people say it's sinister. That was like 8 years ago. Still to this day, I get so many positive comments about that. People are like, oh, I saw you in that thing, in that debate. That was great. And it's like they're treating it as if this is Russian infiltration. But, you know, for average people, it felt so good to have a libertarian, an anarchist, and a communist, which all told represents millions of people in this country, actually be able to talk and decide. But speaking about the people, I think we got one quick question from YouTube here. Juan.
Hey. So there's a question. I saw Lenin Moreno went to DC the other day to consult with the U.S. government. What is Biden's administration planning in Ecuador?
That's a really good question. I know that there is an election coming up where I think the socialist is at, poised to win, which would be huge because we know Lenin Moreno completely sold out Julian Assange and the entire country, essentially, where Korea, I think, still has like an arrest warrant out for him if he returns to the country that he oversaw so many advances in. So it's a really good point. I think that to instruct what Biden will do, we can just look at his policy toward Latin America in general. And unfortunately, it's very anti-communist. And I fear that he is not going to be good at all and potentially stage some sort of coup attempt or undermine the pending election of this socialist figure in Ecuador.
I have the exact same fear. I've heard some chatter on the social networks, as they say in Latin America. There's a fear that they may cancel the election, which is February 7th. Andres Arroz, who is fantastic. We had the opportunity to interview him last year during the quarantine on Breakthrough News about something totally different, about IMF special drawing rights, which he had a great thing about. But if you go back and check it out, you can see great person, great humanity. I think there's a very good chance he could win. But yeah, I think you're 100% right, Abby. We have to be concerned. Before I let you get out of here, just real quickly, where can people find and support the work that y'all are doing on the Empire Files?
Check out YouTube while we're still up before we get taken down. YouTube.com/EmpireFiles, theempirefiles.tv, GazaFightsForFreedom.com, and you can follow me on Twitter @Abby Martin. Thank you so much, Eugene and the team at Breakthrough. Can't wait to join you guys again.